off the list. But then there's other things that we're going to consider. So that, like I said, there really is a lot of leeway and a lot of things to be considered for this group and the policy committee and the working groups and the focus groups. There's a lot of work to do. So hopefully that makes sense. And I'll ask Mark to talk about the specifics of that particular approach that we had. And I will say though also that we appreciate the comments that we received. We received a lot of emails from the group afterwards, and those are very much appreciated. A lot of comments about the signage and a few about, how to improve and questions about the process, which is why we're talking about this group's role. So that's appreciated. And, I think that things are working well. And we've had a lot of good comments, a lot of good questions, people thinking through these issues. Does anybody else have any questions about the role of the committee or kind of what's expected or how it's going to work going forward?
Hey, Jeff, this is Jim Perrick. One comment I might make, and I clearly mean this respectfully, but for the people on the City Council and the Planning Commission that are on this committee, it might be helpful for them to reserve their comments to the end of discussions. I think it would get more input from the broader group. And obviously that's not that we don't want their input, because they have an important role to play in this, and ultimately we'll be deciding it. But I think it might help with the broader input from the whole group.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. And we the other thing we recognized in the last couple of meetings that it's really difficult to get everybody's feedback in such a short amount of time. So I think there is a chat function, and I think Lisa was going to talk about that, so we can see how that works. But just to make sure that you all know that these meetings are not it. I mean, we fully expect the conversation to happen after this and between. You're welcome to call us, email us, do the group chat, and to the extent, and that has happened after last meeting, which we very much appreciate. So if you don't feel like you got your voice heard well enough during the meeting, please shout out afterwards.
Yeah, Jeff, to follow up on the chat, we're working on this end to get it enabled, and hopefully that will happen soon. It hasn't happened yet, but I will let everybody know when it's up and running. Okay.
And we can also, we mentioned early on that we have a Microsoft Teams set up for this group, and where we put documents that are applicable that you might want to look at. There's also a chat function in there. So if you want to go in there and put your thoughts in for everybody to see, that would be great as well. And we look at it and we'll monitor that. That's only just started, and we've received a comment or two through that, so that's encouraged. Okay, well, if that's, I'll hand it back to Lisa then. And if there are further questions or concerns, please let us know.
Okay, great. So we will go back to discussing some of the key issues. There are 3 of them. Hopefully we'll get through them, and I'll turn it over to our consultant, Mark White, to discuss them. And again, he will describe what the issue is. He'll describe what we're proposing as an approach. Then we'll ask everybody if they have any questions about what Mark has described. Then we will do a poll, and when the poll closes, we'll display the results and ask everybody for some verbal discussion. Last time, because of time, we cut that part short. I'm really going to work to allow time for it because I think it has great value. So Mark,
All right.
all
Thanks, Lisa.
yours.
Thanks, Lisa. Can everybody hear me? Raise your hand if you can't. I'm seeing heads nod, so that's good. Thanks. We're going to finish off with 3 of the major issues that we're trying to come to grips with on this part of the code update project relating to signs. We covered others last week. We talked about off-premise, or what Oklahoma City calls non-accessory signs, and how we regulate those. This week, we're going to talk about several specific things, one of which has been an issue lately, and it's one of the reasons why we're here so early as opposed to later in the process. And that's how we deal with signs in planned unit developments and simplified planned unit developments. Those are PUDs and SPUDs. And the next one will be how we measure signs. And then we'll finish off with digital and electronic signs, which are an industry trend, but can also be an issue in just about every community I've worked in. So we want to make sure that we get that right with this community when we put the sign code together. So I'm going to start with the PUD and the SPUD. And I've been trying to balance this out by telling everybody what the advantages are of the way the city does this today. And there are. Codes are usually written a particular way because there are people who benefit from that, and that's a good thing. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the impacts of that way of doing things, so that we all know why we're here talking about it and why there are people who might not be as happy with it as others. So with the PUD and SPUD, PUDs give applicants, even outside of signs, the benefit of a planned unit development is that it gives applicants flexibility to design their site. And it was traditionally designed for large master plan, often multi-phase developments. And under Oklahoma law and the way the city has implemented this, there's a broad range of conditions that a property owner can negotiate that give them flexibility beyond what they can get under the baseline sign regulations. So it may allow a property owner to get a bigger sign, or maybe more signs, or different kinds of signs on their property in a way that works better for their business and their business plans. And I think that everybody would agree is a good thing. I mean, we want a set of regulations that work well with property owners, that to the extent that we can are workable with the sign industry. One of the impacts of the PUD and the SPUD approach is sometimes it allows, because the conditions are negotiated and because they allow signs that can be bigger than signs that are otherwise allowed in the district that was in place before the application was approved. There's sometimes a perception by the general public or others that the signs may be out of scale or out of context with that district. And I think from the property owner's perspective even, the planned unit development is a negotiated process. So while it has the advantage of flexibility, some property owners I've heard, or some developers, call PUD paranoia, uncertainty, and delay. It means it takes longer to get your project approved. You never know what's going to come out of that black box. And developers that I talk to usually would prefer something that's more certain. It gives them a better ability to plan their projects in advance. And so because of that, and this has come up in the context of non-accessory signs lately, where the underlying district would require them, or either not allow them or require them to be removed when the project is developed. Somebody comes in, amends their PUD, and allows a non-accessory sign there as a negotiated condition. And there's been a perception by some that that's either not fair. It gives that property perhaps some advantages that somebody who's working under the underlying district regulations wouldn't have. And again, because it's negotiated, sometimes there may be folks who think that seems a little unfair. So we're looking at some ways to address this problem in a way that's workable, again, for both applicants and for the city in the context of those Plan OKC policies that Jeff showed you earlier. One is requiring the plan unit development to comply with the underlying district standards. And that would mean the district that was in place when that application was filed. So that approach would say that you can arrange your signs a certain way under the PUD conditions. We'll give you some flexibility, but they can't be taller, they can't be larger, and it can't allow a different kind of sign than you could get under the underlying district regulations. Right now, with the C3 and CHC regulations under the zoning code, I think it's section 93.59 of chapter 59 of the municipal code, they require, or they allow non-accessory signs in those districts. You can put a non-accessory sign on a vacant parcel, but when that parcel is developed, the non-accessory sign is supposed to come down. And again, that's some applicants have enabled non-accessory signs after the fact in those districts through amendments to their PUDs. Another approach is to prohibit parcelization. And what we're saying there is to not allow more signs by having a master plan development, chop off parcels that allow more overall signs in that area than they would have gotten under the overall sign master plan. And that would require that master plan to deal with those signs, the overall area, number, size, and et cetera in the master planning. And then to look at a more global and a more holistic master sign plan process. And there's an example there from a community in North Carolina where it wouldn't even be limited to PUDs and SPUDs. If you had a large master plan commercial project, for example, you could submit a master sign plan. We could offer some flexibility, perhaps under the regulations or not, but that would beyond what you'd get under the underlying districts. But this would give the property owner a way to detail how those signs are designed, how those signs work in concert with the underlying buildings, because that was the other policy you saw that Jeff showed you earlier, is that the city recognizes signs as an element of site and building design. And really nice signs can add life to a project and become a real asset for the community. They can improve visibility and et cetera. And this would be a way for property owners to work in a flexible way to come up with a package for the property that works for them. Now, next slide, Lisa. The next slide had some things that show best practices in other communities. Is that still there? That you must have taken that one out. Well, I can talk just briefly then about maybe what some other communities do. That's a question we often get. Modification of underlying zoning conditions through a PUD. I can tell you Oklahoma City is far from the only city that does that. In fact, that's very common. A lot of cities do that around the country. Those are typically, again, tied to the underlying master planning and conditions of approval that happen with the PUD. Master sign plans are also a very common best practice that you see in a lot of newer sign codes around the country. We did a peer review. We looked at some cities similar in size and scale to Oklahoma City and cities in the region. 4 of those, Norman, Fort Worth, Edmond, Omaha, require signs and PUDs to conform to the sign code. You can't get bigger signs, you can't get more signs through a PUD than you would if you're just developing using a baseline zoning district. In Nashville, in fact, prohibits billboards in PUDs. You can have some flexibility for other kind of signs, I imagine, but billboards are specifically prohibited in plan unit developments. Edmond along the I-35 corridor, also it allows the PUD, and it has sort of a middle ground approach here that I thought was interesting. You can modify the location and even the size of individual signs through a master sign plan, but you can't change the overall number or the overall sign area through a PUD. So I'm not saying those approaches are good or bad, but they are what other communities that are either like Oklahoma City or in the region are doing. So with that, I'll open this up. Lisa, I guess you want to open this up to some questions maybe before we go to the poll?
Yes, does anybody have questions about what Mark has just described or need more information about some of the things he's described?
Yes, this is Todd Booz. I had a question. Hey, Mark, on the parcelization, would you explain that for me? If you have a master plan community and you've got it, residential development, multi-use with commercial, and you've got parcels in there already in your master plan community, are you saying that there would be a restriction on the number of signs that you could put on each parcel that had different businesses on them? Or I don't know. Once you have all those parcels identified in the master plan community, where does parcelization come into play? Would they have to get an amendment to the PUD if they were going to try to divide up those established parcels more?
Well, typically, and Jeff, you or any of the staff can jump in if you want and explain this. What we're talking about is trying to provide a way for the master plan at the front end to do a better job of distributing those signs throughout the development. And so you could still split off a parcel. That parcel could still get a sign, but that would fit within the overall allocation provided in that sign master plan. It wouldn't allow you to, for example, get a bigger sign or something because you split off a parcel. And now because maybe you rezone that parcel to a commercial district or do a PUD amendment or something, that would give you a bigger sign. So Jeff, do you or Marilyn or anyone have anything, or Lisa, y'all have anything to add to that?
Well, I think, so for me, I think I was following along with you, Mark, but are you until the last bit? So, we commonly have situations where somebody will come in, say there was a large PUD done, 10 years ago, and it specified signage, and then somebody will come in and kind of do a smaller PUD as take a part of that and do another PUD or an SPUD, and they'll want to revise their sign guidelines or get additional signage and independent of what was already done, and that happens fairly often. And I guess my question is similar to Mr. Booz, and it sounds like you were saying that, in that case, they would still be held to the original standards. Say they came in and did a master sign plan, if you come in and do, you change your zoning on a piece of it, you're still held to the master sign plan. So what happens if, say, Todd has a large development and he's got 10 acres on the corner that are that's commercial, and he's got a master sign plan for it, but then comes in later and wants to add another 2 acres to that. Would we go back? I guess the question is, what do other communities do? Because we obviously haven't defined this for us yet. I mean, do they just say, well, you just go back and redo a master sign plan, just kind of revisit that? Is that kind of the standard?
That, I think, is what other communities would do. You would have to. I mean, if the master sign plan allocates a certain number and area of signs to a property, if you split something off that would cause that allowance to you know, to be exceeded, then you'd have to amend your master sign plan to reflect that.
So, yeah, so once you once you have a master sign plan for a certain area, you're living with that.
But the way I understood,
Yeah.
Go ahead,
I
Marilyn.
was,
go ahead, Clay.
I'll make it quick. Thanks, Marilyn. The PUDs that we've done in the past, that was one of the main things that the city negotiated out was billboard signs. And, you know, it's been a while since we've done them, but we don't have any billboards in our PUDs. So that's why I'm kind of scratching my head. I mean, doesn't the city just negotiate them out from the word go? That's my question, and I'll get off.
Well, that's the thing, is that it depends, you know, that depends on the makeup, frankly, of the planning commission and city council. And, you know, like Janice has said, you know, it has recently, it has been the case that was standard practice. And that's why we want to get a little more clarity with, you know, this approach that Mark has put in, because, you know, it can be frustrating for people to not have a consistent expectation. You know, and I know some of the planning commissioners have expressed a desire to have it codified so that it's, you know, it's clear what the expectation is, instead of, you know, having to make these judgments every time a project comes in. You know, it's the thing we, you know, smile about. You know, everybody wants both predictability and flexibility, so that's the tricky part.
Yep. Yeah. Jeff, this is Todd Booth, but we're not just talking about billboards in these. We're talking about business signs, right? So
Yeah.
if you had a 20-acre deal that you thought was going to be 2 10 acres, and then that didn't make the market didn't need that, and you had to go to 4 or 5 acre deals, then you couldn't get a sign for each business on that under this approach. Is that correct? Am I understanding?
Oh, sorry. What the approach is you just come in and say, hey, you know, things have changed. We want to redo our master sign plan, because, you know, the master sign plan and you know, correct me if I misstate anything, Mark, because I don't have a lot of experience with these in other communities, but you know, that's kind of a, you know, if you have a big development and you want a little bit of flexibility, that's your tool to do it. You don't necessarily have to do a master sign plan. You know, you can just follow the sign code and, you know, do whatever the sign code allows for the parcels that you have. But a master sign plan allows you some flexibility. So if you did one and you want to revise it, that's very doable.
I think Janice Powers.
Oh.
I think it's also entirely possible for a master design plan to have some flexibility built into it, where, you know, if you're talking about 10 acres that you potentially intend to develop as 2 5-acre tracts, then, you know, you can allow for, you know, 1 sign of this size if it's 10, 2 signs of this size if it's 5, and if it's, you know, 20 different parcels on the 10 acres, then each sign that would be allowed, or for each tract, there would be allowed a sign of, you know, such and such size. It doesn't have to be a, you know, one option sign plan, but I think it does have to define the parameters if it's going to be meaningful. I guess the real question here would be what the sort of administrative function of the sign plan would be, in the sense that, you know, if you did find yourself in a position where you needed to amend it, are you talking about rezoning your property just to change your sign plan, or is there some process? I'm not sure I would be entirely comfortable leaving that to a completely administrative process, but I mean, is there some process by which the sign plan itself could be revisited without a full-scale rezoning.
That's certainly possible. And that's a good point, Janice. I'm glad you brought it up because yeah, that is one of the, I think from the applicant standpoint, that is one of the disadvantages of a PUD, because you do have to go back to the Planning Commission and Council. And that's always uncertain, and that can change depending on who's sitting in those seats. And so that, you know, if I'm developing property, that puts me in that makes things a little uncertain for me. So we can create an administrative process for this, and we can do that with parameters too. We could say if you're not changing the size or whatnot, that could be completely administrative. Or if you're not changing the size by X% or X square feet or whatnot, we could do it that way as well. So there's a lot of different ways we could set that up and make it a lot more business friendly than the PUD process, which, you know, is always tough. You know, I think from an applicant standpoint, people may think it's unfair and applicants get things that other people don't get, but from an applicant standpoint, PUDs aren't easy to get often, at least in places where I work. They require rezoning, and that's a legislative decision. So, you know, that can create some uncertainty that maybe we can, while we're, you know, making the code more compliant with Plan OKC, we could also make the process work better through something like this.
And oh, sorry, go ahead, whoever. So,
Oh, I was just gonna, my take on parcelization when we discussed it in like focus groups in different areas was that what happens in the PUD, there's no way to amend a PUD. I think that's another problem in the code. So I have a PUD and I get 3 signs on the frontage. Well, my development changes over time and now I need 4. So I have to come in and take off a parcel out a chunk of that PUD and do a SPUD now. But the SPUD doesn't have any relationship to the former underlying PUD. So that's the problem, is that you're sort of creating a new right for that same, you know, piece of property. And so so I think the master sign plan, yeah, you could amend that, or maybe we have a process where we can amend a PUD. So we don't have to, we can amend the PUD signage or the master sign plan in context with the whole development, not just that little square.
I think that's absolutely true. And I actually had intended to make that same point, but thought maybe it's a little too far outside what we're talking about here. The whole fact that we do not have a method by which we can amend PUDs and SPUDs without going through a full-blown rezoning is problematic. But I think if we're going to go through a sign code update that's separate from the rest of the zoning code, we're going to have to be careful about that, because what we don't want to end up with here is, you know, a set of rules that work sort of in a vacuum, but now it's like, oh, but now we can also amend a PUD or SPUD through some less than rezoning process, and suddenly we've got a system where signage also gets thrown into that. And I think if we're gonna deal with signs separately, we're gonna have to deal with signs separately. And whether or not we ultimately are able to find some way to amend PUDs or SPUDs, or whether we decide to get rid of them, or whatever the outcome is going to be on the other end of this deal, that we don't end up, you know, with a catch-22 here, so that, you know, the decisions we're making about signs through this process get negated by the fact that, oh, well, you can just go amend your PUD or SPUD.
This is Joel Dixon. I think this opportunity builds off of what Janice just said. I mean, we have a chance to separate the master sign plan or master sign, you know, design, whatever you want to call it, from the PUD process. I think that fits nicely into what we're trying to do, developing a sign code and freeing it from the PUD process. I think that, you know, we can separate those two and make it to where, you know, all right, if you're going to do a master development, you need to do a PUD. You have to submit a master sign plan with that, and then that can be more flexible to amend and change as their situation changes and doesn't necessarily require to go through a whole PUD process. I see the two as building well together on one another.
Okay, great, everyone. Thank you. Now we're going to do a Zoom poll that asks, I think, just a little more specificity with what Mark just presented. There are 3 questions. So let me get to it. And then I will share it on the other side after everybody has. Oh, there it is. So you should be seeing the poll now. If everyone can nod or smile. And again, I'm asking just SAT members to vote. Last time we had some members of the public vote, and we called your vote out at the end. So please, SAT members only.
If there are members of the public or anybody on the call, whatever your interest might be, who is not a member of the SAT, feel free to give us your opinion. We still want to hear about it, but the issue with the poll is that when it gives us our immediate results, we can't tell who's in it and who's not. So just for in this moment, it's helpful for just the SAT members to vote. And then, like I said, we always appreciate comments. And if you want to address these specific questions in an email to us, that would be great.
This is Janice Powers. This is another one of those deals. My answer to this question would be very different with respect to billboards than it would be with respect to on-premise signage. I don't have any problem at all with us negotiating size, shape, number, etc. of on-premise signage as part of a PUD or SPUD. I think it's important when we do that, and maybe you should make it clear as part of this process, that it has to have some very real trade-off in the sense that you're going to abide by the municipal sign code just as a starting point. It's like that's absolutely where you are. Now, if you have some very specific reason why this would be better than that, and you're willing to trade it off for other amenities or whatever, that's one thing. But with respect to billboards, my answer to that question would be very different. So that's my 2 cents.
Okay, I show that a couple of members haven't voted. I don't know if that's because everyone's studying the questions or if you are unable to vote, but I'll give it another 30 seconds.
Lisa, did my vote get recorded?
I believe so. I can just see the number of people who voted. I can't see who actually voted.
Okay.
So I'm going to end the poll, and I'm going to share the results. Can everyone see results on their screen? Yes. So the first question was about do not allow the sign regs in the PUD or SPUD to be more permissive than those in the base code. Looks like an equal number of people liked it as thought it needed improvement. Janice, did I get to your point about whether or not we're talking about billboards or other signs? You're muted, Janice.
In the first question, no, I didn't get a sense that we were talking about
Okay.
just billboards or just on-premise signs.
Okay. Does anyone else, anyone who voted needs improvement, want to share what they thought could be improved? Some initial thoughts? Okay.
Lisa, this is AJ Kirkpatrick.
Yeah.
I was struggling with that one because I didn't feel like we really covered that one much. We just covered a lot of ground, but could you restate why we think that is a good idea?
Yes, Mark White, do you want to?
Yeah, and again, part of it, I think the major thing, number one, is certainty for the community. That people, if I know where a a certain zoning district is, I kind of expect there's going to be a certain size and number of signs in that area, and if it increases, for example, and I'm a neighbor, that may surprise me. Second, it's to provide more certainty for applicants. You can look at the sign code now and tell exactly what the regulations are. Although, I guess the flip side of that is you can today in a sense, but you have to negotiate everything. And so I think the other one is just fairness. I think a perception that, some people, because they have better negotiating skills or better attorneys or something like that, sometimes people feel that, yeah, this guy got a bigger sign because of that, not because of some overall public interest or community planning policy or what Janice just mentioned, because there was a trade-off with some other amenity in the project. They just got a bigger sign because they were able to talk people into it. So those are the reasons to tether sign regulations to the PUD. And obviously there are benefits to leaving it open-ended as well. But those are the reasons that, in my mind, from what I've seen the city and from what I've heard from folks at stakeholder meetings and et cetera, has been the frustration with those. Lisa, if you or Jeff or Marilyn have anything to add to that, let me know, because you all have lived with those permitting processes as they've gone forward.
As you were talking, I was thinking, so the next question number 2 about prohibiting permanent billboards in certain districts with the PUD, that's related, because if people are trying to allow things that aren't otherwise allowed in the PUD, that speaks to question number 1, but question number 2 is a more detailed aspect of that, and that's saying specifically, should you be able to allow billboards where they aren't otherwise allowed using the PUD or SPUD process. Again, that one is pretty evenly split between the like it and needs improvements and don't like it. Would any of the SAT members like to comment on that one?
Well, number 2?
Number 2, yes. On the pros and cons of allowing it to be established. I mean, I phrased my question asking for comment of people who thought it needed improvement, but if you really like it, we'd like to hear your voice too.
I've got a comment on it. I guess I'm just not seeing how it limits the discretion that the Planning Commission nor City Council already has, since they'll still have the ability to review these on an individual case-by-case basis, and they do a pretty good job of being thorough and asking all the right questions to see if an exception is in order. And somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but that's ultimately how I view PUDs and SPUDs as this tool or this avenue for a solution where your project doesn't automatically fit within the code that's already there. So if you limit what can be in that application, what's the alternative then?
Yeah. Jeff or Mark, do you want to?
I think we're kind of saying that we would,
Go ahead, Marilyn.
well, I think we're trying to say that, you know, and the only reason I know anything about this is all I do is review PUDs and SPUD cases day in and day out. So I see what people are asking for and what's not working for them in the code. And so I think what we're saying is, you know, once we get the sign code adopted, there's a lot of things in the sign code that don't work for people. That's why they're coming in for PUDs and SPUDs saying, I need something different, particularly with O2 office signage, but it works better. Then at that point, you would just follow either the master sign plan or the sign code, and you wouldn't be able to vary that in a PUD. That would be the concept. We may not like that concept, but we may want to keep it so you can still vary signs in a PUD. But like in a C3 zone, you can only have a 200 square foot sign. We just approved a 650 square foot sign, you know. And that was for a particular case, and we may want to keep doing that, or we may just want to fix the sign code, and then we won't have to worry about it in PUDs and SPUDs anymore.
Yeah,
case by case.
Yeah, I did mean to mention that last point a minute ago, that these, you know, when we're talking about what to allow or not allow in the PUD process, we're asking those questions assuming that we have updated the whole rest of the sign code to make it more appropriate, more flexible where it needs to be flexible, so that you should have less reason to have to really need to vary it.
To speak, this Janice Parrish, to speak directly to Mr. Uday's question, I think, you know, it has been our policy in the past not to allow PUDs and SPUDs to be used to vary, to place billboards on property that's, you know, zoned commercial or commercial highway in the past. But, you know, there seems to have developed this idea that, you know, we don't really have any basis upon which to refuse to do that. So I think the thought process with respect to this proposal is to provide that basis upon which to do what we have been doing for quite some time, as Mr. Farha pointed out earlier.
Right, so it's all more predictable, and people don't have to rely on having to argue for it or against it.
Yeah, and just to be clear, this would limit the planning commission and council's discretion. These things wouldn't come to them, or when they came to them, they would come to them with the guidance that these signs have to comply with these parameters, and right now they don't. So, you know, from that perspective, so I hesitated. This does limit. Today, they have discretion, and this would limit it. And I think from what I thought I heard Mr. Uday say too, is that he kind of thinks they've done a good job in the past. And if that's what you think, then yeah, the status quo makes sense. You know, if you don't think that approach works, or if you think it has potential downsides, then it makes sense to look at changing it.
Hey,
well,
Lisa, this is Scott Cravens. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Just for the benefit of the SAT members that you know are going over this, I'll just provide the counter to Mr. White's comments. I've been on commission for 2.5 years, and I can think of a few instances where it just immediately come to mind that I would share with all of you as you think through how you feel about these things. There have been instances where people come in and wanted a sign that was taller than what code would allow, and there were changes in the topography of the land. So like this particular lot was 15 feet lower. So if you put a 35-foot sign, which would be allowed, you wouldn't see it. There have been instances where people have wanted billboards and PUDs along highways where there's no development at all. It's essentially vacant land all around it. There have been people who wanted signs on highways that abut neighborhoods. And there's a variety of concerns and things that, at least as a planning commissioner, I think through when I make those decisions, and it takes that discretion in order to do that. I think because, like a lot of people, at least for me, I feel like those decisions are a balance between the importance of economic development and impact, and allowing people, signage that will create successful developments, and at the same time protecting neighborhoods and other uses that may not be compatible. So it's really easy to throw a question up here, or to have a conversation in generalities. But when you start throwing out words like do not allow or prohibit, I think you're taking away discretion that in a lot of these processes is necessary to evaluate specific sites. So I'm trying to be respectful of the members that are here that don't have a chance to voice their opinion as often and be quiet. But I feel like that's something that I should share as you guys think through it, because I think that's an important thing to remember about this process and why we're there to begin with.
Yeah, Scott, this is Jeff. That's a good point. And, I think, some of that could probably be taken care of through the Board of Adjustment. And you may be referring to some of those cases. Some of that would not be appropriate for the Board of Adjustment, of course. And some of it could be, like Lisa was saying, we would, make improvements to the sign code that would cover some of those. But yeah, you're right. If we did do this, it would limit that discretion. And, we would basically be making a choice for predictability over flexibility in this case, if this were to move forward.
Right. Now, I'll add something to that as well. And those are, I think Mr. Cravens makes some great points here. And I did mention there are advantages to the way you do things. I didn't make any bones about that. There are advantages to it. But I think with regard to the specific examples he mentioned, and I know those aren't the only two, but what we want to get to in the code is to codify those situations as much as possible. So we could also create a framework where those metrics in the zoning districts in the sign code have built into them the ability to administratively approve a sign that gets you that extra visibility. For example, if you have a change in grade so that, yeah, your sign is otherwise 35 foot from the ground surface, but there's a change in grade that substantially reduces, the height of your sign as it's viewed from the roadway. We could allow staff to allow the sign to be taller to account for that, and that we can bake that into the regulations in a way that doesn't send people to a public hearing, whether that's to the Planning Commission and Council or to the Board of Adjustment. And again, once you get to a hearing, the outcome's always uncertain for applicants. So, but those are good points, and I think they merit consideration.
Yeah, and that's a great example of, kind of one of the purposes of this group. We know about those, common issues, if we can address them in the code. We're never going to be able to address everything that comes up, but that's one of the things we're trying to do. If we know that, hey, we commonly have, these are the reasons people need to come back and go through this onerous, not onerous, but, longer than necessary process. Ideally they wouldn't have to get an adjustment to or wouldn't have to go get a spud. But they have to because, they have elevation problems. Well, know about that and other common problems. We can bake that into the code.
Jeff, this is AJ Kirkpatrick again. In some of my due diligence and prior to this process, I talked to former staff that characterized it as we almost had become addicted to putts and spuds. And so outside of the sign conversations, I guess I've wondered, is one of our overall goals here to reduce the reliance on putts and spuds and to have a clearer path forward so that we're not having to do these individual negotiations and burn the staff time and the commission time? I just would like to hear something to that effect.
Yeah, this is Jeff. I've heard that from many people, you know, I think in all walks of life, basically, from planning commissioners to staff to just lots of people that, you know, the amount of PUDs and SPUDs that we do is really high as a percentage of the amount of cases that come through. And that's because they have their advantages, but unfortunately, we think it's really because of the limitations of our code. I mean, that's the only way that a lot of people have to get, you know, the development they want that their neighbors are comfortable with. So yeah, we absolutely want to make a code that you know, when for example, we had our when we did phase 1 and we did the code diagnosis, we had the former planning director from Denver, and they redid their code and had a drastic decrease in the amount of PUDs and SPUDs because people were able to use their zoning code more effectively. It was and so they didn't have to go through this more lengthy process and negotiation to get what they wanted. So yes, we definitely want to get there. I think, you know, we'll always have a need for PUDs. You know, they're an important tool. There's no getting around it. But I just think, you know, that we can save people the trouble, and that means developers and planning commissioners and city council members, just by having a better code.
So the question I have that's relevant to this is, and I think this came up when I was reading the diagnostic report. To remind me, I don't believe anybody has actually gone back and looked at our recent PUDs and SPUDs and tried to group them about why generally they were needed. Is that fair to say that we've never done a breakdown of, you know, this is the 3 most common reasons we're getting pushed into PUDs and SPUDs? And I wonder if some of that relates to signage.
Oh, go ahead. Is that Sarah?
Yeah, this is Sarah Welch, staff. We actually are doing that analysis, and I have some figures right here about PUDs and SPUDs if anyone's interested in the number of PUDs and SPUDs we do, the number of land we've zoned into PUDs and SPUDs. I have it all available. I don't want to take up too much time, but we are doing that analysis. We know signs is one thing, but even if a PUD or SPUD is not submitted just for signage, it's always part of the negotiation because you have to address it in your PUD and SPUD. So we do, I know the priority is on signs right now, but we do PUDs and SPUDs, like Marilyn said, all day long. And we're constantly trying to help people through the process that are trying to do infill development in our core or trying to get a PUD approved, you know, out next to maybe some neighbors that might not agree with what they're trying to do. So there's lots of reasons to do PUDs and SPUDs, but can I throw out some numbers real quick?
Real quick, Sarah.
Okay. In Oklahoma City, so far, what's come through the door has been 3,023 applications for PUDs and SPUDs. That's not all that's been approved. That's just like as of today's applications. That's how many have been applied for. We've zoned, as of May of this year, is the last time I did the analysis, 71.97 square miles have been individually negotiated. And if it's hard to imagine what that is, I did a calculation, and that's the same as, that's if you added up Nichols Hills, War Acres, Bethany, Mustang, Moore, and the Yukon. All together, that's how much Oklahoma City zoned in PUDs and SPUDs. So yes, we would like to have a code that people can just go get their building permit, not have to rezone. That's all I'll say.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to, I want to recognize one member of the public to speak, and then I would like to switch topics. So Troy Schweinberg, if you asked to speak about the PUD issue.
Yes, I was listening, and my biggest thing on this is that if you make the PUD more stringent, does that not just put the variance process at a higher, you just kind of push the bubble over to something else? So I think that the ask whenever we were in the focus groups was allowing the ordinances to be better to where we didn't have to go to the PUD, but not where the PUD became the focus. So by pushing to make it more stringent here, you just push it off to a different part of the same city staff or.
Right. Yeah. The point is not to push it off to another body. The point is to make the whole rest of the code more adaptable so that it doesn't have to go to any body for additional approval. And then things that really do need variances because of statutory criteria that they are heard by the Board of Adjustment for that reason. But as you can see, there's lots of gray area. But yes, the point is to improve the whole sign code. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, but I think that was my point, is that the sign code itself within the PUD, by attacking that, it doesn't help.
Okay, thanks. So next topic is how we measure and allocate signs.
All right,
So,
thanks, Lisa. All right, yeah, this is kind of the guts of any sign code, is, you know, the metrics, and that's what applicants need to know. That's what neighborhoods representatives want to know, is how big and tall signs will be that are near them, and sometimes how much they can put in their own property. So that's always an important consideration. You know, one of the advantages of being more flexible is, yeah, you allow more flexibility for business. You allow more room for communication, whether that's about your business or a political candidate or otherwise. The bigger the signs are, the more flexibility businesses have to do that. And I think it's probably also worth mentioning is that, you know, people are living longer. We have more older folks out driving, and if you're like me, your eyes don't get better with age. So having signs that are too small can make it hard for people to identify property. It can cause businesses to miss customers. It, you know, can even create issues with traffic. So those are reasons to be more flexible with the standards. Reasons to be stricter, consistent with the OKC policies, which does use the word restrict, and that's not my word. That's the city's adopted, that word's in the city's adopted policy. Communities do that because the fewer signs you have, the less clutter. Sometimes in some districts, if buildings are smaller, good example is lower intensity residential districts. If signs are really large, they can be out of scale, for example, with buildings and sites in those neighborhoods. And so most people that I talk to around the country find that signs that are scaled proportionately to the site and to the buildings, as the plan policy talks about, are usually more aesthetically pleasing, and signs that are spaced further apart. And there's sign industry research, actually, because I read as much of that as I can get my hands on, does recognize too that a sign that's further away from other signs is more conspicuous. You start putting signs closer together, then they start to blend with each other. They become issues with traffic, with motorists, and individual signs are harder to spot. So we're trying to thread that needle and walk a balance between those two considerations. They're both important for a lot of different reasons. So some of the approaches we talked about are tying sign size to building size, and to an extent, the height regulations that you find for signs in every district, and the area regulations, which currently, as they do in just about every sign code I've ever read, that does scale signs to the district in a sense. What we're talking about here is looking at an approach that says maybe not having a sign that's 50 feet taller than the building. Like if you have a 12-foot high building or a 24-foot high building, not having signs that are sort of out of scale with that would be an approach. Another one, and we had a comment, I think, after the meeting last week that tied to this, was to tie signs to street type. Some communities do this. I'll show an example next that's kind of based on conventional street categories. But in our first meeting, we talked about Plan OKC and how it has a much more robust set of street categories now. And I know one gentleman mentioned in our meeting the difference between that some, like in strong towns, they make a clear distinction between streets and roads. Streets which are more multimodal, that handle a lot of different ways of moving, roads that are typically geared to the automobile. And freeways are an example of that, and that's why you usually have billboards along freeways. It would be hard to read a small monument sign sometimes if you're traveling 55 miles an hour or more on a freeway. So signs tend to respond to the built environment around them, to the way people get to and from places. And so one approach is to tie sign size and sign height perhaps to street design. And a lot of times those streets have a design capacity for speeds, and lower speed streets could have smaller signs and higher speed streets could have bigger signs. So that's an approach. The same with building height. And so we could do that with area, and we can do that with building height. We could do one or the other or both with street type, in addition to or instead of zoning districts. And so those are approaches we're talking about. And then having an allowance for artistic signs. There's two ways to deal with this. One is we did some work with Memphis years ago that did have a discretionary review process. If somebody came in with some odd looking sign that would otherwise not comply with their underlying regulations, but it was interesting and creative, there was a process for that. The downside of that is it's really hard, if not impossible, to come up with clear standards. I mean, what's creative and not creative, and what's creative in a way that's beneficial to the community is fairly subjective. But there are communities who have done that. Another approach which is much simpler, and one of the comments after last week, and this was also mentioned in our stakeholder outreach, is a more elegant and simpler way of dealing with this. Is right now the way the city measures signs is I think it just kind of uses a square or a rectangle of 4 sides, and your sign type has to fit within that rectangle. Well, some communities in the region, I think Norman and others, go up to 8 sides, and that way you can fit more. You can have a larger sign just by virtue of the way we measure them. That creates more flexibility for signs that aren't squares, that are oddly shaped, and it gives applicants signs that are a little bigger. But I think most people, if you drive down a street where a sign was measured by rectangles and one where they use the 8-sided metric, they probably wouldn't notice much of a difference. And that also accommodates signs that have different shapes, different geometries, and perhaps more organic creativity associated with them. So those are some of the approaches we're looking at. In the next slide, just the way, what some of our peers are doing. And not many, and I searched, there aren't very many sign codes that directly tie sign size to building size. Edmond does have something where you get your signs per square foot do scale with shopping centers, not for other building types. With shopping centers, those scale to the gross leasable area of a building, and they're smaller if your building is under 60,000 square feet or over 60,000 square feet. So there's a different formula for those that result in bigger signs for bigger buildings in the context of a shopping center. Street types, again, are also less common than zoning districts. Most sign codes that I've seen tie sign size and height to zoning districts. There is a model code that APA has. There's a planning advisory service report by Dr. Dan Mendelker. He's a law professor in the St. Louis area that has a model, what he calls street graphics code, that's been adopted by communities. I think Columbus, Ohio, a few others around the country have done that, where they just pretty much tie signs to street type. And those street types, again, have different travel speeds associated with them, so the signs are scaled to those. Some communities have different size and heights based on traditional road categories. And the table from San Antonio is an example of that, where you can get a 16-foot tall sign and up to 75 square feet. If you're on a local road, on an expressway, you can get up to 50 feet high and up to 375 square feet, and with differences in between depending on the arterial category. And so those are some examples. And I just think that the graphic up above from Tulsa, one thing you're going to see in the new sign code too is a lot of new graphics. We do that quite a bit. I think for the general public, it can be confusing. It's even for urban planners and attorneys and people who read sign codes all the time. It certainly helps to have graphics that explain how things are done. It gives people examples of signs that comply with the regulations and et cetera. So with that, Lisa, I'll open it up to you to take questions, and then open it up to questions for the SAT.
Yeah, before questions, I'm actually going to want to recognize a member of the public who asked to speak on this topic. It's Kenny Peskin with the International Sign Association. Kenny, hi, unmute yourself and just limit your comments to a few minutes, please.
Thank you, Lisa, and the rest of the group. Mark made a mention about the idea of having sort of some flexibility for artistic or creative sign forms, and mentioned in the context of a larger sign. And I think one sort of minor clarification isn't that the sign becomes larger, it's that it's not penalized as much under the measurement formula. So if we were to use an example of a well-known logo, if we're talking about Guitar Center, where it has a guitar that projects sort of above and below the line of text that says Guitar Center, if you do a single rectangle as opposed to a series of polygons, the penalty for area is about 63%. They have a creative design for their wall sign, and they're penalized if they are put in a individual rectangle. So we had put together a document, those of us at ISA, on what some of the measurement formulas are, and I will submit that to staff. But there are about 10 or 12 commonly used formulas. Generally affects wall signs more than freestanding signs. Most freestanding signs are rectangular because the sign is also, the structure is supporting the sign, so it tends to be a greater amount of rectangles. But I think it would be worth considering that in some of these situations, the applicant might be penalized based on the methodology used by the city unintentionally. And so trying to clear up some of those issues allows an applicant to better use their allotted sign area. Similar to that, the other thing I wanted to mention in the discussion of various things with sign area, an approach that has been very successful and to the liking of a number of applicants is to consider the allocation of the sign area, the permanent sign area allocated to the site more broadly, to allow that area to be sort of transferred from one sign to another. The allowances of one sign per frontage of an attached or a wall sign, or one freestanding sign. There are situations where somebody might want a wall sign, they may want a projecting sign, they may want some type of awning, and allowing the allocation, allowing some flexibility in the allocation of that overall sign area for the applicant often can result in better, more creative design signage. Thank you.
Great points. Thanks, Kenny.
Thanks. Okay.
This is Janice Powers. I wanted to say about this. You know, this is such a difficult area, it seems like to me. I mean, as I understand it, here in Oklahoma City, what we have is sort of a combination of building size and zoning, so that, you know, within a given zoning category, you know, a building that has this much square footage or this much linear frontage, you know, may have, you know, a sign allowance of X, and as either of those things changes, either the zoning category or the linear footage, you know, the size of the sign may vary. And I have just not enough experience with all of that in a business sense to know how problematic it is either to measure and work around and live with or enforce. But the issue of creativity for signage, I think, is so problematic because to me, not every logo is a creative sign. But at the same time, I recognize that we have, you know, a limited ability to actually restrict commercial speech. I mean, we have a constitutional limitation. So I would be all for us finding, I think we have a really good mural system for approval in the city. If a sign is really a mural, then maybe it needs to go through that process. I don't have any particular, we had someone not very long ago say they thought that signs painted on buildings were, you know, tacky looking, and I don't have that same sense myself. I think that the fascia or the facing of a freestanding sign is almost the only piece of our sign ordinance that is difficult. You know, how you count the base and how you count the background and how you count the lettering versus, you know, what it really says and what it really conveys. And again, I just don't have enough everyday experience with that to know how to fix it. But, you know, the idea that a sign has more expressive ability than just the lettering on it is something that I think just we have to recognize as a given.
Thanks, Janice. Does anyone else have any questions about the information Mark shared or Kenny shared?
This is Asa. I do think, and I apologize, my connection is bad, but I do think it would be beneficial to discuss further the drawbacks of spot zoning. Obviously, we've been talking about spuds and PUDs in relation to sign ordinance and why that's a hassle for staff. But I feel like it would be good to review it in context of, you know, the city's intent to unify zoning and concepts around zoning moving forward, and how spot zoning is an issue in that regard.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Asa. Yeah, we'll talk about that next time. That's okay, and stay focused on signs for now.
Sure, I guess I was bringing it up in the context of signs, but next time is fine.
Well, and again, well, yes.
This is Joel Dixon again, and I can't stress enough how important I think putting our sign size and allocation into the context of understanding, you know, who the audience is and breaking it down like Mark stated at the beginning of this discussion between streets, which are there to build community wealth within a successful place, and roads, which move people and goods quickly between successful places. And I think that context really, when we put signs into that context, are we there to communicate to people who are building wealth within a community, or are we there to communicate to people who are traveling quickly between successful places? It makes it very clear, at least in my mind, from my perspective, you know, what signs need to be and how they need to be, who the audience is that they're trying to communicate to, and what the context is in which they're placed. It becomes a lot clearer, I think, as long as we couch it within those terms.
Yeah, this is Councilperson Cooper. I've held off. I hope I'm following protocol. I really want to echo what Mr. Dixon is saying there. And I think it's the, for me at least, the magic elixir, because I think in the previous meeting, someone mentioned, where Councilman Stone and I will find ourselves in disagreements. But to Councilman Stone's comment in that previous meeting, he and I agreed. Actually, Todd and I agree so much more than we don't. It's really fun. I'm a big fan of his. But when we were discussing specifically in the 39th Street LGBT district, whether or not we were going to approve in a SPUD a billboard, Joel's words are really coming back to mind. My argument was that as we're crafting this district, honoring its history, there's a street enhancement project, gets underway this fall, be ready by Pride 2021. That's going to be from 39th there at, Penn and Young's, but I suspect that as the district evolves and grows over the next decade, won't surprise me at all to see some of those businesses and whatnot start shifting under the I-44 and Young's Bridge over where folk were proposing this billboard. And in my mind, why would we want some giant, structure that's imposing down upon people as we're trying to foster walkability and bike infrastructure and that sort of placemaking in that area. So I really do. I think that the street and road definitions they seem like really good guidance here. So I just really want to echo what Mr. Dixon is saying there. Oh, and Todd agreed, if I remember correctly. So that was cool.
Hey, real quick, Lisa, I just wanted to make a point. Just the last few commenters, I just want to clarify, when we say street type, we are actually referring to Plan OKC's street topology, which has several different street types. And so I think that was our intent, to be able to tie, for example, one of those street types is Main Street. So these areas with a Main Street feel are going to have a different, need for signage than you would on a major arterial. And so that was kind of a way of bringing in right now it's based on heavily based on zoning. Well, you could have the same zoning district in vastly different areas, but the same regulations apply. Whereas the street topology really is based on not just the pavement width and the cars going through, but the land uses around it and the buildings and all that. So I just wanted to clarify that that's what we mean when we say street type, and that's what the signage would be tied to.
Jeff, this is Joel Dixon again. I understand that, and I'm familiar with the street typologies in Plan OKC. My argument is that that's too many. we have too many different typologies. Really, it really should just come down to, is it a street or is it a road? Is it a street for building wealth in a successful community for all users, or is it a road that connects via high-speed, connection travel to successful places, two or more successful places? And it becomes very simple that way, and I think it becomes very easy to put things into context and then very easy for people to understand, all right, hey, this is a street. It's geared towards, yes, there might be people on automobiles, but there's going to be people on foot. There's going to be people on bicycle. There's going to be people utilizing other means of locomotion. Maybe it's the electronic scooters that we have around our community. And the context for that kind of audience, the context of a sign for that kind of audience is going to be very different than if you are on a road traveling, at 50, 60, 80 miles an hour, going between successful places.
Yeah, I understand.
Okay, let's go to our next poll question, and there are only two pretty straightforward questions. Joel's comment leads right into them, actually, and that is it's just one question is, should we tie sign size and height to building size, or should we tie it to street type? We haven't yet got into the detail of what that size and height should be. Before we do that, we want to get a read from everybody on if they think we should do either. So let me go to the next poll. You should see it. And yes, this poll does assume there's not an option for something else. This poll is assuming that we would tie it to one or the other. Right now it is tied to building frontage and zoning district. But if everybody will vote, then we will have a few minutes of discussion on the other side. We still have several people who haven't cast their vote. If you haven't, please do so now. Okay, I'm going to end the poll and I will share the results with you. It looks like many people like the idea of tying it to the street type, but doesn't look like there's too big of an aversion of tying it to size and height. Mark, are there any specific questions that will give you more insight into this question, into this poll question that you want to ask the team? You're muted, Mark.
Yeah, yeah, we've kind of asked these questions at 30,000 feet, and I think that gives us a basis to go on. You know, as we put regulations together, I guess my question would only be, is there anything anybody wants to add to that? Kind of like Janice said after the first poll, her answer would have been different with billboards. Does anybody have any thoughts? Well, I kind of like this, or I can live with it, but I'd like you to do X, or make sure you look out for something else. That would be the only question I would have.
Well, this is Janice Powers again. I'm sorry I keep speaking up, but you know, one of the issues and one of the reasons why maybe we have so many PDs and SPDs is that, and in Ward 2, which I represent, there are a lot of streets that have really become commercial or arterial streets, but that still have a lot of single-family residential properties that front them. And signage is one of the ways, I think, that the encroachment of commercial uses along those streets kind of leads. We're not big fans of seeing conversion of residential structures to commercial uses along those streets. But if the street typology is all you're looking at and not the zoning or the size of the parcel or the size of the building, then you can end up with a situation where there are signs that I would think, because they're geared for a commercial or arterial street, would really be inappropriate for an area where there are still single family homes. And it's those small differences, those technicalities, which again, we actually have quite a lot of in Ward 2, that concern me about taking, one approach or the other, and that's all you're looking at.
Okay, so I think you're suggesting too that we overlay this on top of our district metrics, not replace them, is what I think.
I think that's right. I mean, I voted yes on both of these because okay. I think there's a place for each or both of them.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah, that's a great point. Okay, we have about 15 minutes left in our meeting. I think we can get to our last topic really quick. I think it's pretty straightforward. I might be wrong, but it's Emd Signage.
Yes, and EMD stands for Electronic Message Display, as you can see. You see, it's an industry trend, so that's an advantage, and businesses and even things that aren't businesses like churches, like you're seeing there, like them because you can change your displays pretty easily without having to reface your sign, without having to do other things. That church can display, a ton of messages. I mean, depending on what your required hold time is, I mean, you could display hundreds of messages every day. So on Tuesday, they can let people know about maybe a Bible study on Wednesday, and then after that, they can let people know when services are on Sunday morning, for example. Businesses can change their messages rather quickly, as we've all seen with gas stations, and gasoline prices change a lot. And so it's common with a gas station canopy that you've got an EMD that changes that display when the gas station displays. And it's an initial upfront investment for the business, but over time, I think they find that they probably save money in the long run by having that. And find businesses I talk to when I do sign code updates always tell me, I mean, it gives them more flexibility to advertise what's on their site. So there are clear advantages to those. On the other hand, people, we sometimes get pushback in communities I'm in because of glare, and there are studies that assert that signs like these, because they change their displays a lot, because of the way they're designed, can create traffic distractions. You should know that there are also studies that say the opposite. And some people don't like them at night. They think it interferes with dark skies and things like that. So there are issues. Those are some of the pushback you'll hear from people for and against EMDs. The city today has a pretty robust set of regulations for them. It's got 3 levels that they defined. Level 1's a static display. Level 2 allows you to travel and scroll the messages. Level 3 allows animation and full motion videos. So it has those. It allows up to 6,500 nits. That's a technical term that regulates brightness. So they allow 6,500 during the day and 500 at nighttime. And so they have a way right now of controlling how bright a sign can be. So we want to, our approach was just to make sure we're in line with best practices regionally with our peers and with other communities. And number 2, to make sure that signs aren't too bright near residential zones so that they interfere with the use and enjoyment somebody's home. This table here just shows you some different ways that other communities measure signs. So you can see Tulsa, I think in Oklahoma City, do the same thing. Norman doesn't allow signs to be quite as bright during the day. San Antonio has a far more detailed way of measuring signs based on nits. Other communities use a measurement called foot candles, and that's basically the same 1 foot candles, the brightness of a candle, a typical wax candle, I guess, over 1 foot. Some communities use that just because a foot candle meter is a lot cheaper than the kind of instrument you need to measure nits. On the other hand, when you get a sign, the manufacturer has maximum displays, typically, and that's the terminology they use sometimes. If Kenny's still here, he can probably weigh in on that too. And I have read, I think some of the industry literature recognizes using nits a certain distance away from, or foot candles a given distance away from the sign. A lot of communities prohibit EMDs in residential zones. Some have setbacks from residential zones. And projection signs, you don't see, those are signs that are just like projected onto the side of a building. Other than some communities that just ban them, and I think that's only because that's a default. They don't want to get into the niceties of how you would measure them or people complaining. And some communities just allow them in certain districts. And so those are the in-betweens I've seen. I haven't seen a lot of communities that do a very detailed job of regulating those, but that's something that we're looking at as part of the update. So with that said, and I believe, when I talk to folks in the on-premise sign industry, especially, I think I think Troy and others can correct me if I'm wrong. I think they were fairly satisfied with the way the city measures it now. But just because it's an issue, we thought we'd raise this and try to get some sense from the SAT if there's anything we need to look at when it comes to how we deal with EMDs today.
Thanks, Mark.
Right.
Kenny, do you want to add anything before our discussion? You're muted. Yeah, there you go.
Oh, thank you. There are just two things I wanted to bring up as points. Generally, the sign industry, both the on-premise sign industry and the billboard industry, prefer the foot candle standard for a couple of reasons. That tends to be the default standard that state departments of transportation use when evaluating and measuring billboards. It tends to be more context sensitive. It's not simply measuring the output at the face, but takes into consideration how it impacts the neighbors. So we think that is a more workable way. And Mark also mentioned the measurement tool is less expensive. And most likely folks in the street department already have access to foot candle meters. The only other thing I wanted to mention is as it pertains to residential zones. I know that the existing code language already has a curfew for electronic signs in residential zones. So I think that's one important thing to provide some context. The other one is to keep in mind that some of the users of an electronic sign in a residential zone aren't necessarily commercial businesses, and maybe schools or libraries or government buildings or small churches that for whatever reason never rezoned their property. So sometimes it may be useful to consider the impact on a residential use as opposed to necessarily a residential zone. So just be aware that it's not necessarily a commercial business that may have a sign in a residential zone. Thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Thanks, Kenny.
Thanks, Kenny. I'm actually going to take that comment as my cue for the poll that we can discuss on the other side, because the poll question addresses exactly what you just asked. So in the interest of time, I'm going to launch the poll.
Lisa, this is Janice Powers. Before you do that, there is a point I want to make about EMD signs. It was recently pointed out to me, and Mark kind of made reference to this just now by saying you can put tons of messages on them, hundreds of messages per day. I think EMD is really a sign multiplier. And I think maybe it would be a good idea for us to take that into consideration as we're thinking about them, particularly in the context of billboards. You know, we're talking about limiting or eliminating or reducing billboards in the city of Oklahoma City. If we are talking about cap and trade and, you know, those kinds of trade-offs, one of the things that I think we might keep in mind is that a board can serve the function of, you know, an almost unlimited number of different physical boards just by virtue of its ability to change its message. So I think maybe we need to factor that in as we're talking about, you know, billboards and how we're going to deal with them and control them. If a single board is really an EMD board, is a sign multiplier in that way, is it really necessary to have so many physical structures? So I think it's worth thinking about that. The issue that Kenny raised about EMD with respect to residential properties is very much Oklahoma City. We have, you know, any school, any church can establish itself on R1 property. And so we have a lot of churches and schools that are embedded in neighborhoods. Now, I don't know how much of an issue. We've always had pretty good luck getting those entities to limit their nighttime signage use, but it is very much the impact on surrounding properties. A little less so for me about travelers, but I think we need to be mindful of that. And all EMD signage really ought to be the least it needs to be at night, in my view.
Thanks, Janice.
Thanks.
Okay, I'm going to just launch this poll real quick because to talk on top of it while everybody's looking at it. Yeah, so we're asking, should EMDs be allowed for civic uses that are located in residential districts, like churches and schools? We see cases every month where these entities are trying to get EMD signs. Again, we're just saying up or down, should they be allowed? If they are allowed, we're assuming that we would have identified appropriate sizes and locations and brightness in the code, but we're just asking from broad concept if we should make provisions for those. Then if EMD regulations for commercial uses need to be tightened. Again, at this point, we're not defining what that tightening might be. It might be, again, size, location, brightness, as Mark mentioned. And Janice, I personally agree with you about the, you know, looking at EMDs as a way to get more with more messaging with fewer physical signs.
To that point, however, again, keeping things in the context of the location and the audience, you know, if it's a billboard we're referencing here, which is going to be on a road, a high-speed avenue of approach that's connecting productive places, it's all well and good if you have 100 different messages that you can put up on an EDM, but the audience isn't stationary. They're not going to see 100 different messages. They're going to see maybe 2 messages when they pass by it in the morning on their way to work and when they pass by it in the evening on their way home. So I'm not saying that that's an argument that we should use to have a bunch of EDMs everywhere with tons of messages all day long, but I think that it's important that we understand the context in which these signs are and
Sure. Okay, I'm going to end the poll because I know people have to go. And so it looks like most people think, yes, that churches and schools and similar should be allowed to have EMDs. And it looks like the EMD regulations could be tightened up a little bit in commercial use.
Lisa, we're not seeing the results on our screen.
Sorry. Can you see them now?
Yes.
Yes. Yes, so it looks like we could tighten up a little bit on commercial uses. Again, we'll come back to you on what we think that might look like and make provisions to allow civic uses in residential districts. So with that, thank you again, everybody. I'm sorry we had to initiate the chat very early on. Now we know that before we start the meeting. So next meeting we'll have it. The next time we get together, it will be us presenting what we've drafted as a first pass for the sign code. And we'll describe what we're proposing, how we've reacted to everybody's feedback. It'll be some time before we meet to do that. So it'll be a very busy couple of months for us. But we will present that to you. It'll be presented in an interactive software that will allow you to comment on it. And then we'll present it, give you some time to review it and comment, and then we'll meet back to gather up everyone's recommendations. So as always, feel free to reach out to any planning staff with further comments or ideas. Jeff or Mark, do you have any final closing comments?
I think you covered it, Lisa. Yeah, thank you for your time and input, and further comments are encouraged. We'll be looking for, especially if something needs improvement in your eyes, please let us know how, and or you don't have to tell us how exactly, but maybe what your issue is, and we'll try and find ways to improve and get the best draft possible out for you guys to look at.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks everybody for your participation, and especially the comments. I think they were submitted after the meetings too. I found those useful. So
thank you.
Okay, thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.